So in this video, I want to break down the episode mechanics of one of my favorite shows, which is Jay Acunzo's How Stories Happen. And so this has become both one of my favorite shows, but also Jay is one of the smartest people in the world when it comes to creating show concepts and then translating that into episodes that have a compelling structure to them that pull you through them, keep the momentum flowing. And so Jay is somebody who I have learned a lot from when it comes to the actual show concept development side of things. That's kind of where my obsession with it started, was Jay's obsession with it. And this kind of like shared belief has emerged that, really this is the singular thing. Developing your show concept is the biggest gap in most shows. And then once you have that concept, that kind of trickles down into the episode mechanics. And in my experience, I know Jay focuses a lot on the actual concept development stage, which is kind of before the rubber meets the road. It's still conceptual at this point. What I have often found is that along with developing your show messaging, as well as doing a bunch of show concepting exercises, which I spend a lot of time working with people one-on-one, the episode mechanic side of things actually often flows back upstream as well. And so often by having a kind of fuzzy idea of what our show concept might be, once we start trying to translate that into highly listenable episodes, we realize that the show concept becomes more clarified as well. And so to me, it feels like this circular process where, okay, we come up with a kind of idea for a show concept, and then we start to think about, okay, what does that look like in an actual episode form? What is the actual listener experience? We try and do some free writing exercises and kind of clarify those to become clearer about, how do we express the concept? How are we going to market the concept? And so we do try a lot of the copywriting up front before we ever even record any episodes. And we kind of just go through this process of writing and concept development and episode mechanics, and the show becomes tighter and tighter and tighter. And so a lot of times this work is done before a show ever launches. But if you've already launched a show, which is most of the clients that I work with, then we go through this process and tighten everything up. And usually what happens is the show becomes easier to market, easier to get more listeners into, more fun to create, easier to create as well, because you have a set of kind of guidelines that guide everything that you're doing with the show. And you're kind of able to subconsciously, without even thinking about it, you have an idea and it kind of slots itself into the framework that you've created, and it becomes a lot easier from a mental standpoint, like a cognitive load standpoint, but also from an actual time perspective as well. At least this has been my experience and a lot of people who I have worked with. So let's go through this and look at the episode mechanics of How Stories Happen, which again is a show by Jay Acunzo. This show, if you have not listened to it, I highly recommend it for anybody doing any kind of creative work. Really, storytelling is at the heart of most creative work. It's at the heart of basically all marketing as well. And we could get into some of the details of that there. But I think without kind of successful storytelling, the rest of your marketing is going to very much struggle. And as a podcast creator, a content creator, storytelling is very much at the heart of that. Whether or not you can think of what you do, or whether you personally think of what you do as storytelling, there are probably elements within it. So essentially, the preface here is that in How Stories Happen, in every episode, Jay invites on some kind of author, speaker, creator who uses storytelling in their work and writes stories as part of their work, whether that's for a newsletter or a podcast or a book or a talk or whatever it might be. And he gets them to break it down. They kind of dissect it together. And this is a theme of a lot of Jay's work. Being in the podcasting space, you might have come across his show 3 Clips in the past, which is essentially doing a similar thing to podcast episodes, where he sits down with a podcast creator and plays 3 clips from an episode that they bring, and they use those as prompts to then talk about the craft of making great podcasts. So fantastic show. He doesn't create that anymore. It was actually acquired. He sold the show a couple of years ago to Castos, I believe. Now he's moved on to this show, How Stories Happen, looking at how do great stories come together? How are they developed from idea to, story over time? So what we're going to do here is go through an exercise. I have basically, this is not Jay's work. This is my kind of ascribing my suspicions onto how he thinks about creating the show into this document. And so this, as we can see here, this is an exercise I call episode blocking. I know that Jay does do a version of this exercise as well for shows when he's developing it, and so this is something that I do as well. I think actually probably most savvy podcast creators, networks, media companies all do something very similar to this. Might have their little tweaks here and there, but we're going to kind of go through this exercise together, and hopefully we'll see how the structure of Jay's show makes it very easy to create and edit and streamline. And it also makes it very transparent, where from the outside, you could describe a typical episode and somebody would be like, whoa, that sounds awesome. I really want to listen to that show. So, a couple starter points here. I've got a couple other episode mechanics notes at the bottom, but we've got the red bits at the top and the bottom. These are stock elements, and so these are not recorded fresh with each episode. These are kind of standardized elements that the opening to every episode is exactly the same. It's identical, the same piece of audio he just drops in, and same for the outro. So we'll look at those more specifically in a second. And then we've got kind of these three blocks here. And so these are kind of the intro elements before we get into the main body of the episode, which in this case means the guests being introduced. And so these are all Jay at the start, setting the scene. And then we've got these four here as well, which are the beginning of the actual episode here. And there's some specifics here. This is kind of, we're going to get into the differences. These are kind of like the yellow is all guest stuff, but there is a distinction between these lighter yellow and this darker yellow. So we'll get into that as we go through this. Okay, so let's start at the top with the stock intro here. And so when we're doing the episode blocking exercise, these are the kind of spreadsheet that we want to fill out here. And we kind of number everything down here. We've got the different kind of blocks down the side just by number, and then a description of the block, the purpose of the block. This is the purpose for you and the show and for the listener. Like, what are you trying? Why does this block exist? Why? What is our intention behind it? And if we don't have an intention, it shouldn't exist. There should be no reason for a block to exist without a purpose. And so we want to define, okay, what is the job that this block is doing? What is the target length? This can be very loose or it can be very tight. What is, an example of some of the contents that are going to be in this block? And then what is the emotional listener or experience? What are we trying to do at an emotional level or a momentum level with this block? And so that may be different from the purpose. This is a more feeling kind of exercise that we're doing here. And so essentially, we want to be able to have answers to everything that exists on our show from a framework, and so that our shows have a consistent feel to them that people can build a habit around, that they can keep coming back and listening to. They can anticipate, they can know a little bit what they're going to expect, with it still being surprising each time out based on the specific content of the episode. So again, I have not talked to Jay about this. This is just one of my favorite shows. I've listened to, most of the episodes, and I listened through a couple episodes and basically wrote down how I perceive the show to be structured based on how it is generally produced. So the first thing first here for Jay is the stock intro. So like I said, this is a intro, same one. It introduces the show as a whole and kind of gives you the overview of what the show is. It happens at the start of every episode. It's about 30 seconds long. And essentially it just, like I said, gives you the pitch for what is How Stories Happen. What do we do on this show? The purpose here, what I suspect the purpose to be, is to orient listeners and affirm they're in the right place. And so essentially, somebody clicks play for the first time. Probably they have some information based on the cover art, on the title, on the show description, and maybe even the episode title, depending on how much they read. But they may not. Maybe they skipped reading the description. They heard a friend tell them, like, oh, you should listen to the show. They opened it up, they click play on an episode. And so now this is their first experience with what is this body of work, this show as a whole. And then, so what we want to do with that is essentially tell those people, like, okay, if you're into this, you're in the right place. And so if they're into learning more about stories, how stories happen, and improving their own skills as storytellers, we want them to know, hey, this is the show for you. And then the second piece is by repeating a kind of succinct, short kind of couple sentences long description of what the show is. Now we're giving them the language for them to be able to sell and market the show for us. And so if they want to tell their friends about it, which is usually in most cases the number one way that shows grow, they now have the language to do that consistently. And a lot of times this is something when shows don't provide this, or they have a 60-second long, multi-paragraph long description of what the show is, it becomes really hard for your listeners to become advocates for you. So this is probably the purpose of this first block. Block 1A here, this is an ad slot, and so this is not present in every episode, and it's dynamically inserted, and so there may be episodes where there is no ad whatsoever. I know certainly some of the first episodes that I listened to had no ads. Currently, when I've listened most recently, there have been ads for Jay's products, and so these are specifically for promoting internal products. And so Jay does not do ads for, to my knowledge, typically other companies. He's mainly using these to promote his own newsletter, his own community membership, and his own workshops and events and things like that. And so this is about a 60 to 90 second ad read and written by Jay. and it's relevant, human-centric ad kind of related to one of Jay's products or upcoming events, and so it's very like relatable. And the last thing I didn't cover, the emotion or listener experience of the stock intro. I think what probably he's trying to do here is communicate relevance. And so this feeling like, oh, okay, this sounds interesting to me. I'm in the right place. Legitimacy. And so this is through the production elements, the music, the Jay's tone of voice, his vocal delivery. All of these things is meant for within the first 30 seconds, even preferably within like the first 3 seconds, somebody's like, oh, this is a well-produced show that is going to be worth my time. And he certainly does a good job of that. And so this is what I think is happening. The goal is for the listener experience, and then energy. And so this comes through in the music. And again, Jay's like the way that he presents vocally in this intro section. In the ad here, my suspicion is that curiosity and desire are, and I think there is also the way Jay reads ads. I think there is something about trust that I would say would come in here as well, where he feels trustworthy. He doesn't feel like he's trying to rip you off. It feels like he's presenting you with something that is actually going to benefit your life. And so I think that is a key part of this as well. Okay, so whether or not there is an ad, the next section here, the next block 2, is the clip montage. And so these are a collection of pull quotes, clips pulled from the episode. And the key thing to think about here is that this is not just one clip without context. It's actually a series of clips that provide this little montage that brings more energy than usually a single clip does. And so there are these little like 5 seconds, maybe 5 to 8 second clips, maybe up to 10 seconds. I don't really think that long in most cases, that provide a little snippet of the conversation that gets your mind bouncing around a listener like, oh, we're going to go from here to here to here to here. And they're all broadly relevant, and they're all the most intriguing bits of an episode. And so it lays out like, oh, okay, we're going to cover all this ground. All of this sounds interesting. And I'm a big fan of actually doing these clip montages rather than individual, just one clip. I think usually one clip without context is not very interesting. It's not very compelling. I think the clip montage, if the guest is saying interesting things, is better. Personally, I actually think no clips is the best option at all, and actually just narrating and scripting an intro yourself. But if you are, highly skilled in thinking about narrative and thinking about like, okay, what is the story that this 30 to 60 second worth of clips is telling? Like, there is a journey that these clips take us on, even though it's not like a logical progression necessarily, but it's more of a conceptual journey of like, okay, we're going to talk about this and here and here and here. And maybe some of those are tactical and some of those are emotional, and you're pulling those all in specifically. I think clips can do a great job, but I think you need to be highly competent with storytelling and editing and production in order to be able to do that. And Jay is obviously all of those things. So this is 30 to 60 seconds. And so really the idea here is to create 2 or 3 open loops by hinting at some of the juiciest talking points coming out in the episode. And so we're introducing something of these things. We're not giving away the answers. We're hinting at some of the stuff that kind of inherently lacks a bit of context, but together provides us with this map of where we're going. And so the content's going to be 2 to 3 of the best or most intriguing clips from the episode, and the emotion or listener experience. We want to seed some intrigue, maybe some connection to the guest and or the topic, some momentum, excitement, anticipation of what's to come. These are all things that we're looking to do in this section. Okay, so the third one here is the guest intro. So this is where Jay comes on, starts his narration. And so this is about a 2-minute section here. And so my suspicion here is that the purpose of this is to quickly establish topical relevance. And so what we're trying to do is connect the guest and the topic to the listener's life. And so really, this is something that we want to do very early in every episode, is be able to have the listener who, may have clicked play on an episode that they're like kind of interested in, but they're not yet hooked. We want to make them see that like, hey, this is relevant to you. There is something that is going to be either useful or interesting or entertaining based on you personally. And so this is going to be, it's not something that you have no stake in and is kind of like not worth listening to. And so that idea of topical relevance, Jay does very quickly early on here. He's not trying to talk about the guest. He's talking about the topic and the listener. And then the guest gets introduced after that, because the listener doesn't care about the guest until they have this kind of idea of topical relevance in many cases. In some cases, if you have a well-known guest on, which Jay actually often does, you might be interested in that guest and hearing their perspective on their storytelling. But even still, like if you can get both topical relevance and guest relevance, then you're great. If you can, settle for either one, I would go for topical relevance first. And so Jay does a good job of that. And so, what he's also doing here is kind of helping the listener kind of geolocate themselves in relation to the topic and the guest. And so, he gives a bit of background on the topic and help the listener understand what they're talking about, how this conversation will relate to them. And then he also talks about the guest and tries to surface some of the relevant kind of experiences and or personality traits or interesting things about the guest that help the listener see themselves in that guest. And so we're trying to what we don't want is a lot of times people who are interviewed on podcasts feel like these otherworldly creatures that we can't personally relate to, which is a bad thing. Like, we need to be able to connect to the person and see ourselves in them in most cases, especially for a practical show like this. Otherwise, we're going to write off everything the guest has to say and say, well, okay, easy for them. Like, they have all these resources or whatever. And like, I could never do that. Or they're like way more charismatic than I am, or, whatever it is. And so we want to be able to ground that person and say, hey, this guest, is has all these traits that you might struggle with this as well, or they might be just like you. And so that's what Jay is trying to set up here in the guest intro in just 2 minutes. So, in terms of the contents, Jay starts often with a kind of listener oriented hook, is how I think about it, or a contextual hook, where it's essentially just like basically presenting a scene through a very, a single paragraph or two, playing out a scene that you can see yourself in, which then leads into the guest and the episode topic. And so it's setting out a scenario saying, like, imagine you're in this situation, you want to do this, but you have this problem. And so what do you do? Do you do this, do this, do this? Or is there another way to do it? And then you get into like, well, today's guest actually has found that they did all these wrong things, and then they just stumbled onto this other thing, and they're going to share that with us today. And so now we're like invested because, like, oh, we are in that situation. We tried this, we tried this, we tried that, or we've been thinking about it. We don't know which one to do, and oh, now there's an alternative solution. Great, we're bought in and we're ready to go in very little time. The other things might be a summary of the guest's background and work relevant to this conversation. And the specific keyword here is relevant to this conversation. And so it's maybe not the guest's whole backstory. It's what does the listener need to know to begin this conversation with the appropriate level of understanding and knowledge of the guest. And so the emotion or listener experience we're kind of digging into here are relevance. And so again, it's going back to this idea that this should feel relevant to our audience. It should be interest and curiosity. Those are some of the things we're going for in this guest intro. All right, so far we've got the intro done with. So we've had kind of 3 blocks, maybe 3.5, depending on there's this the ad here, and now the guest is actually introduced. They're on the mic. So far, this has taken us about like maybe 3 to 4 minutes or something like that in a typical episode, maybe 5 at the top end. And now the guest is coming on the mic here. So the first block here with the guest on the mic, I would really call this block all about context, connection, and orientation. And so Jay's done a little bit of introducing the guest here so far. Now we're going to actually hear a little bit to get to learn a little bit more about the guest ourselves. And we're going to do that in Jay's case here by kind of show, don't tell style storytelling and question asking. And so this is not asking the guest, so tell us about what you do and how you got here. It is asking the guest questions that will allow themselves to reveal themselves through their answers to those questions, which is a much better way of starting an episode because, again, the listeners probably do not care about the guest at this point. What they care about is what the guest has to share that will help them. So Jay gets right into it by asking questions that both tell us something about the guest while also being helpful to us. So the goal here, the purpose, is to get to know and connect with the guest, get the listeners to form a connection with the guest and their work without them telling us directly who they are. This should be both useful and connective for listeners. And so this is about a 5 to 10 minute block. It kind of sets the scene for everything that is going to come in the episode, kind of the main event. And so a lot of times, Jay will either go with an intriguing opening question or one of his go-tos. One of his very first questions that he uses in a lot of episodes is to ask them to talk about their creative practice. And so this is both a question that is useful to listeners because listeners all have a creative practice of this show, or they're looking to create one. And also, there's actually a few points here. So a lot of listeners do have a creative practice. One of Jay's big messaging points is that you need a creative practice, which is very closely tied into his product, which is about helping you build, maintain, and maximize your creative practice and turn it into the best work possible. So it's a key kind of core part of his brand messaging as a whole. He wants to insert that in the conversation here. But then also somebody talking about their creative practice, like this is a personal, intimate thing that it gives us a window into that person's world while also kind kind of giving them an opportunity to offer a bunch of useful nuggets that we might be able to take away for ourselves. So, fantastic first question, this one about the creative practice. And this is usually his default, is my understanding. And then occasionally, if there's a better way to start this conversation that relates more specifically to what they're going to talk about, then he may opt for another first question there that does a similar job. And so the kind of emotional experience here, the listener experience we're going for is kind of connection with the guest. Hopefully, we are able to see some of ourselves in the guest at this point, especially now that we've heard their voice and heard them talk about a little bit of their own practice or story. And then again, it's still reinforcing that relevance. So much early on in the episode is about relevance, where people still have maybe the phone in their hand the first few minutes. Maybe they haven't committed to it yet. They're trying to think, is this useful to me? Is this interesting to me? And so we want to establish as much relevance as possible early on to make people feel like, okay, I'm going to get a lot out of this. Me personally, I am going to get a lot out of this. Not that this isn't like, a great episode for anybody else. Hopefully it is, but it's like, yeah, this is going to be the best use of my time right now because this is so relevant to where I'm at. Okay, so now we get into the actual story breakdown of the episode. So we have this idea of how stories happen. Every episode revolves around one signature story of the guest of that episode. This now is what we get into here with the next sections. And so these follow a very standard format in every episode of the show. And so the first is the story intro or overview. So we move from the context into the introduction of the story. Jay asks the guest to introduce it, give some background on it. And so if there's any, necessary context here. And so this was actually, performed as a talk. And maybe the first time I performed it was at on this conference, this stage. And now I've told it, 10 times on different stages, and I tell it on podcasting and whatever. And so we understand, okay, this is a spoken story. And maybe we know the guest talks a little bit about where it came from, what the purpose of the story was within their talk or within their business. And so we know, okay, we can situate where does this story live in the guest life and also potentially in my life as well. And so this is usually about 2 to 5 minutes. And it's just kind of like a couple short background questions that keys up the story and surfaces any relevant backstory or content related to it. We're not getting super into it yet, just the kind of overview that gives us context for what is about to come. So here, again, a little bit of relevance and also curiosity is what we're going for here. We're kind of getting people to want to lean in a little bit as they're hearing about this. Okay, so next up, block 6 is the story read through. And so what we're trying to do here is get this audience up to speed on the story we're about to dissect and unpack. So if the show revolves around, dissecting and unpacking stories, we actually need to know what is this story. And so that is the role here of the story read through. And so in this case, it varies depending on how long the story is. Usually it's around 3 to 8 minutes, I would say. And essentially, the content here is that the guest reads the story. And so they read it live on the podcast. And essentially, the experiences that we're going for here, to my estimation, are immersion. We want the listeners to feel immersed in the story. We want connection with both the guest and whatever the story's about. And maybe we even want awe. I think that this is actually an important emotion to point out here, where if I'm Jay, what I want is, and I'm a storytelling coach to some extent and a marketing coach, I want the listeners here to feel like, wow, that was such a great story. I want to know how to do that. And which is exactly what's going to come. So there's some anticipation building for like, how did they do that? And maybe it's even worth adding anticipation for the upcoming breakdown in here. And so this is really what we're looking to build during the story. It's also just a necessary piece. Before we can dissect it, we actually need to know, what's the story we're talking about here, specific lines, things like that, the flow of it, the characters, whatever it might be. The other thing I'll say with storytelling on Jay's show, this is nonfiction storytelling. Like, this is marketing storytelling in most cases. It's not like fictional storytelling or anything like that. And so when we're talking about characters, it's characters within that story, which might be the person themselves who told the story or whoever else they encounter in that story or whatever it revolves around. All right, block 7. This is the real meat of the episode here, is the story unpacking. And I mean, it's the biggest block. We have had, it might be about half the episode, maybe like between a third and a half of the total runtime of an episode is the story unpacking. And so as you can see, we've got a decent chunk of content already to get to this point, but it's all been building towards this, and it flows really well into this. But this is the big one here. So this is the story unpacking. And so essentially the purpose here is to give the audience a highly tactical insight into the construction of the story while connecting to higher level concepts and themes. And so one of the things that Jay does really well here, and a lot of shows that are really well produced do is they pair this combination of both tactical and conceptual. And so, as a educator and coach, part of Jay's job is both to give you tactical nuggets on what to do, but also connect them up to higher level theories and concepts and strategies to understand where do these tactics fit and these small micro practices. And so this is part of what they do in the episode, is looking at highly tactical stuff that you can take away and say, well, in order to tweak this, I wrote it this many ways, and I did this exercise where I looked at it through these different frames of view. I tried it out here, I tested it on people, but then it's also attaching this up to this bigger idea, maybe around like story experimentation, maybe he has, or something like that. And so it's being able to take this specific practice, tie it in to a bigger theory, and then zoom in and out around these different points of the story. And so that is the purpose of the story unpacking, is both going narrow and specific, giving people tactical things to walk away with, but also connecting those narrow specifics up to higher level concepts and theories. Like I mentioned, this is around 15 to 25 minutes typically. And the contents here are usually to dig into 3 to 5 themes and or topics the story speaks to. And so this should be a mix of highly tactical and more broadly conceptual. And so in this section here, usually Jay will have like 3-ish jumping off points. And so there'll be 3 things that's maybe stood out to him. And he'll say like, okay, I noticed this line here. Let's talk about that. And what stands out to me is that you do a great job of character development in a really short amount of time. And so here we have this big concept of character development. And then now we're going to zoom into one specific line and talk about like what's going on here with this wording that allows us to get a sense of you or this other person or the place or the setting in so few words and so little time, that makes us as an audience like really feel that and connect to that. And so now we can have a 5 to 10 minute conversation around the specifics of character development, and also why it as a theory is valuable and important, why we should be doing that. And then Jay will have maybe a couple other kind of jumping off points where he'll pick something out from the story and say, okay, now let's jump over to this and use this as a jumping off point to a conversation. It's kind of like the anchor for a separate conversation. And so this is something that this makes episode construction so easy when you have like, okay, here I've got my overall kind of episode mechanics or episode blocking sheet. And then even within the story unpacking, all I'm looking for is 3 specific things that stand out to me. And I'm going to pick that and be like, okay, like this is, unique to Jay's concept here. But he's like, okay, I'm going to just like, when I hear or read the story through, when the guest sends it over, I'm going to pick out, oh, that really that's interesting. Okay, what's interesting about that? Well, it does a good job displaying this. So there's my question. It's like, you don't even need to think about that. And the research is minimal. And basically the guest can send you over the story. In Jay's case here, I imagine he doesn't need to do all that much prep for this. He signs the guest. The guest brings them the story that they want to workshop. Jay reads through it and he's like, okay, that's interesting, and that's interesting to me. Let's use those as our jumping off points. And I'm sure he does more background research, but it's actually very easy to put together a highly compelling episode because his structure is so good. And it is, you could make the argument that this is formulaic, and that's what's great about it, is that the unique questions are going to be different for each guest and each story because different things stand out. But it allows us to build an expectation as an audience around what we're going to get each time, and we come to trust the format and expect and anticipate it. We want to hear different episodes and different people and their stories run through this framework to help us better understand how stories happen. So the kind of audience insights or emotions here and listener experience, we want to have insight. We want to have aha moments. We want to have them leaning in and turning up the volume and rewinding to listen to moments again. That's what we're really going for here with this section. And then I make a note here that there is this first last favorite section. And so this is kind of a sub block that kind of similar to, I feel like there was another one, the creative practice question here. Sometimes this is its own kind of micro block. This is a bigger block that often occurs, not in every single episode, but it does occur in many of Jay's episodes, if not most. And so this little exercise, first, last, favorite. So this is kind of a set piece that often occurs within this story unpacking block. So it's a sub block to that. And so essentially the overview here, the content is to get the guest walk through the thought process behind the first line of the story, like the opening, the closing of the story, and their favorite moment in the story. And so the purpose here is to zoom into 3 specific aspects of the story that are kind of highly leveraged components of the story: the first sentence, the last sentence, and then the favorite of the guest or the writer here. may not have any specific relevance to the audience. Maybe it's just their personal favorite thing for some reason, but it is an interesting way to understand the story through their eyes, and then understand the thought process there. And so this is usually about a 10-minute exercise. And again, we're going for, the same things here. This is a sub component of this one, so it's going to be the same experience. It's insight, aha, leaning in, rewinding to listen again. And then basically from there, this is usually about the end of the episode. And so we then have the stock outro and call to action or calls to action. And this is about 1 minute as a whole. And so essentially the purpose here is to build awareness of Jay's other offers, from his newsletter to his products and services, and as well as reinforcing the show brand and positioning. And this is a really important one that Jay does well, is that Jay will, if you listen to the show, he has his calls to action. They feel tight and condensed. And then he actually ends on more of like this rally cry behind the big mission behind the show about making work that matters more. Like, when you make work that matters more, you need to market less. And so that's kind of one of his core messages. And so he kind of ends the show on this uplifting message, and the music is a perfect fit. It's energetic. It has momentum. It is like leaving you on the upswing. And another thing that he does really well that more shows really should do, movies generally, this is a well-ish known concept in film screenwriting, less so in other forms of content, is really getting out fast, making your last point, ending on a high note, and then getting out very quickly, letting the end, don't let the ending kind of like simmer too long. And I know so many shows that just like peter out, where they have like 4 minutes of calls to action and the stock outro, and everybody's tuned out by the end. And it's like, actually, if we can end on a high note with the guest, we want to end the episode as quickly as possible and get out. There's more advanced ways to think about that as well, but usually I think if you're, most people are not ending on a super high note, in my experience listening to most kind of indie shows. And then there's also the ending is too drawn out. And so I think what we want to end is like on a punch, like an exclamation point with the guest, and then get out as quickly as possible after that. 30 to 60 seconds max, with appropriate like music and vibe that like reinforces the feeling that that guest has ended on. So essentially, the contents of this stock outro and call to action, we've got credits for his cover art, producer, and I think maybe a couple other things. Calls to action for consulting, newsletter, and rating and reviewing the show, and then ending with this call to arms. And so the feeling here that my suspicion is that Jay wants to reinforce is inspiration, momentum, possibility, uplifting, kind of just like energy. Like, it feels energetic, and so we feel like ready to shoot out. It's like you're shot out of a cannon at the end of the episode. So this is Jay's kind of episode blocking document, as I would fill it out as a longtime and regular listener. I may be off about some of these things, and this would be something that I'd actually love to talk with Jay about and see how close I got to his thought process behind this. Maybe that's something that I'll look to do in the future. But I hope that this helps understand a little bit more about how to apply episode mechanics. This is just one kind of small aspect of episode mechanics. I say small. This is actually a pretty big part of it, a very important part, as you'll probably see. That when you have this structure, it becomes way easier just to slot ideas and process them through this framework, and they become really compelling. And this is something that is my probably literal favorite exercise to do with people. And when clients go through this and then they like get on one of the calls and they'll like walk through their episode blocking, and you can just see like everybody's eyes light up and they're like, whoa, I like didn't really get your show, and now this sounds awesome. And so this is a great exercise to do for yourself at some point. Now, there are a couple other things that I want to make note of related to Jay's show and his specific kind of additional, beyond the episode blocking, additional episode mechanics notes that I think are worth looking into. So the first one here is that Jay uses music cues throughout his episodes. And so often between questions, so he might have, if we go back up to, well, both in the story unpacking section as well as in this context, connection, and orientation section, this might be a 10-minute section. He might have 2 to 3 questions within that. He will ask a question, the guest will give an answer, and then he'll have a music cue that's this little transition. Maybe it's like 8 seconds long or something like that, that kind of just like resets your attention. So now you're like, okay, that thing's ended, and now it pulls you back in. It gives you this opportunity as a listener, if you've tuned out, to come back in and say, oh, something new is happening. Let's refocus ourselves here. So that is the first thing to note about this, is that he is using these cues to help pace the episode and kind of sense your progression through it. Give listeners opportunities to come back in, new on ramps back into the episode. But the other thing is that they also are like distinctive musical cues. They don't sound like typical podcast music. They're interesting. They're kind of novel to some extent, and you pay attention to them, and what will over time come to be able to associate them with the show. So they're like not just generic, like sound like every other corporate podcast or something like that with podcasting music. And so this is a really clever way that Jay uses these breaks in his show. And I should say as well that they are consistent every episode. So it's not like he's finding, doing all this research to find new musical cues each and every episode. He's got his stock music that it's part of the show's branding. Okay, so the second thing here is that Jay makes heavy use of his particular brand of humor, starting very early in the intro by including a joke or a wry comment, like right in the intro to every episode. And so here humor is a huge part of Jay's brand, and like a particular type of like dad humor and puns and things like that, kind of self-effacing humor, taking a joke too far and laughing at himself and referencing it. And so if you read his newsletter, you will find this. Really, if you engage with him in any way, you will find this. And so he introduces that very, very, very early in each episode in the first couple minutes. So you already feel some of the quirkiness. You feel maybe some human connection. If you're not into that humor, like maybe you get turned away, and like that's good. But it really differentiates the show early on by helping you connect with Jay as the host and being like, oh, this isn't like a stuffy show or anything like that. Like this is going to be fun. It's going to be interesting. And Jay continues using that humor throughout. And so that he sees that early on, and he makes it a big part of every episode throughout the episodes. But my suspicion is that he has a very specific rule for himself that there must be a joke in the intro to every episode. That is my suspicion, and it's one of these things when we're talking about like episode rules, the elements that make for your best episodes. That I'm guessing this is one of Jay's that really does a specific job. It's strategic, and it also helps people build attachment and connection to the show. Okay, so the other one here is that Jay gives himself a lot of leeway to speak directly to the listener and display his own expertise during narrative asides. And so this also kind of ups the production value yet again, where he will zoom out of a conversation with the guest, and he'll do one of these musical cues into a narrative kind of break here, where he's going to talk for 2 minutes about a higher level concept or something like that didn't come up in the actual interview. And so one of the primary job of this show for Jay, from the outside, I'm assuming here, this seems like an obvious assumption, but is to get more clients and customers for his business. And so he wants to position himself as the expert. And so both in the conversations, these are structured much more as conversations rather than interviews, where Jay inserts a lot of his own thoughts and beliefs and process while also talking with the guest about theirs. But he also has these narrative kind of like zoom outs where he is speaking directly to the listener and kind of actively teaching or instructing in some way. And so this is also, it does two jobs. It ups the production value. It also positions him as the person to learn from with this podcast. And then the last one here, which if you have done a lot of podcast editing, you will notice this, is the editing on the show is super tight. You can hear that a lot has been content edited and trimmed down to keep like the pacing is snappy. It is quick. I would not be surprised if he cut half of the raw content from the interviews. That would not surprise me at all. And it might be closer to a third, but I would have to talk with Jay. But that is my assumption based on the feeling of the episodes, is that like, yeah, things are moving. We are not wasting any time on things that are not valuable to the topic at hand here or this interview. And so these are a couple other things that stand out to me as listening to this show. And all of these are things that Jay has clearly defined previously while he was developing the show. These are all things that are intentional, strategic, and done consistently to serve a specific purpose with the show. And so hopefully this whole exercise in breaking down the mechanics here, the episode mechanics of how stories happen, has been helpful. And if this is something that you are interested in doing for yourself, then definitely check out the episode engineering workshop, where we're going to go much deeper into some of the principles that we talked about here, some of the exercises, as well as a whole bunch more. All right. Looking forward to seeing your own episode blocking exercises and anything else that you come up with related to your own episode mechanics. And if you do, please feel free to send them my way. Would love to have a look at those. And we'll talk to you more real soon.